Hello everyone, today's video is about the inverse trigonometric functions. So for example, if we have the function f of x equals sine of x, we know that f of pi over 6, for example, is sine of pi over 6 or 30 degrees, which is 1/2. I'll sketch here the unit circle just to help illustrate the idea. So of course, if this angle is 30 degrees or pi over 6, this point is root 3 over 2 comma 1/2, and therefore sine of 30 degrees is the y coordinate of the point, which is 1/2. The inverse trigonometric function is called arcsin of x. In the calculator, sometimes it is written as sine minus 1 of x, which is kind of confusing because that is definitely not 1 over sine of x. Therefore, I don't like to use this notation. I will use arcsin instead of this, but in the calculator this means arcsin, not 1 over sine. So when the inverse function takes us from y to x, that means that if I ask it how much is the inverse of 1/2 or arc sine of 1/2, the answer of course is pi over 6, and that's what the inverse function give us. However, for example, pay attention that here there is another angle, this angle here, that is 150 degrees, for which this point is minus root 3 over 2 comma 1/2, and that means of course that sine, so for example, if I ask how much is f of 5 pi over 6 or 150 degrees, that is sine of 5 pi over 6, which is again 1/2. However, if we ask the calculator how much is arcsine of 1/2, it never gives the answer 5 pi over 6, it always gives the answer pi over 6. Why is that? Simply because we have defined, in order to avoid problems in the definition, we have decided that the answer should be between minus pi over 2 and pi over 2. So for example, if we ask how much is the arc sine of minus 1/2, that means here there is a point where that is root 3 over 2 minus 1/2, and of course this angle here is also 30 degrees, the answer will be minus pi over 6. In other words, the function arc sine of x, its domain is between minus 1 and 1, and it is range is between minus pi over 2 and pi over 2. Pay attention that sine of x, you give it the angle, it gives you the y coordinate in the unit circle, where arc sine of x, you give it the y coordinate in the unit circle, and it gives you the y coordinate. Therefore, the y coordinate in the unit circle goes between minus 1 and 1, and the angle between minus pi over 2 and pi over 2. Arc cos of x. So for example, if we have the function cos of x, and we ask it, for example, how much is f of pi over 6, the answer is root 3 over 2. There is of course another angle that you can see here, that f of minus pi over 6 is also root 3 over 2, as you can see in the unit circle. However, arc cos of root 3 over 2 gives back the angle pi over 6. Why is that? Because we have decided, the humans, that in order to avoid problems of definition, the function arc cos of x receives as input an x coordinate, that means of course it has to also be between -1 and 1, and its output, the angle will be between 0 and pi, not between -pi/2 and pi/2, but between 0 and pi. So for example, if we ask it, how much is arccos of -√3/2, pay attention that -√3/2 is right here in the unit circle. The angle will be 5 pi/6 or 150 degrees. So that is arcsin, arccos. What is left is to discuss arctan. So the function arctan of x. So first tan of x. So tan of x, of course, in the unit circle relates between the angle and the slope of the line. So for example, if this angle is pi/6 and this point is √3/2, half, f of pi/6 or tan of pi/6 is simply the y coordinate divided by the x coordinate, which gives 1/√3, which is the slope of this line. The slope of this line, of course, is 1/√3. So you give tan of x receives an angle as an input and gives you the slope as the output. The function arctan of x receives the slope as the input and gives the angle as an output. So for example, if I ask you how much is arctan of 1/√3, of course the answer is pi/6, although again there is another angle, for example this angle here, that is 7 pi/6, that corresponds to the same slope, meaning tan of 7 pi/6 is also 1/√3. However, once again, we have decided, in order to avoid problems of definition, that the input, of course, is any real number, since the slope can be any number. But the output, this is f of x, the output of this function is an angle between -pi/2 and pi/2, meaning if, for example, how much is arctan of -1/√3, meaning if the slope of the line, the slope of this line is -1/√3, and of course this is the angle, then the answer will be -pi/6, although there is another angle 5 pi/6 here, but we have decided that the output will be an angle between -pi/2 and pi/2.